Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff. I'm delighted that you could brave the weather and be with us today. I also want to thank everyone who's joining us on live stream and the other web formats. Thank you for being with us. If I can ask everyone here, if you could please silence your cell phones. You're very welcome to tweet as much as you like, all the earth-shattering news that will come out of today's discussion, but please, no cell phones. I am very, very proud to be joined on today's podium with my friend Eliot Cohen. Eliot is the Robert E. Osgood Professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, director of its Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies, which he founded, and I think it's fair to say one of the greatest historians and strategists that we have in American academia today. And what additionally makes Eliot such a rare scholar is that he is also a scholar who emerges from the academy and contributes to our policy and political life, most notably with service as counselor to the State Department in the George W. Bush administration, and no shrinking violet to public debate ever since about issues on our national political agenda. I first met Eliot as a graduate student. I was a graduate student at Harvard a generation ago. Eliot was then a young professor, and it was a wonderful experience taking your course. And I still admire you despite that. And so thank you very much for being with us today, Eliot. So among the many contributions of a think tank is that if it should provide any contribution, it should be to provide context. And since there's nothing happening in the Middle East these days, this dull moment is an opportunity to step back and ask a question. When was American policy in the Middle East born? When was American policy in the Middle East born? Of course, policymaking is an iterative process. Successive presidents and their administrations inherit from their predecessors, adapt for changing times, bequeath new legacies to their successors. But there are key moments, foundational moments, pivotal decisions that do define the contours of policy for decades. They loom large both as moments that triggered a sharp departure from what came before and as milestones etched in our memory. And when it comes to the contemporary Middle East, two landmark events spring to mind. President Roosevelt's March 1945 meeting aboard the USS Quincy with the founder of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, which laid the groundwork for the strategic bargain, energy for security, that has been at the core of that relationship ever since. A second foundational movement is 3 years later, May 48, when President Truman disregarded the advice of George Marshall and his other senior advisors and recognized Israel, ensuring that America would play a pivotal role in the Arab-Israeli set of issues ever since. Now, there have been other candidates for foundational moment, birthday for American Middle East policy. Some will cite Truman's decision to protect Turkey and Greece, the Truman Doctrine, which made the defense of the Eastern Mediterranean and, by extension, the broader Middle East a key aspect of American policy. Others will jump up ahead to Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy in 73-74, which laid the groundwork for what we now know as the modern peace process and America's engagement in that. Others will point at George H.W. Bush's decision to lead an international coalition to reverse Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which was the starting gun for 25 years of America's engagement in that part of the Middle East. Still, I think that if historians were to be polled on the topic, the two really foundational moments would be Roosevelt Ibn Saud and Truman's recognition of Israel. I think they would come out first place. And indeed, if you look back at the last 70 years, in many ways, the history of U.S. policy in the Middle East has been the history of presidential efforts to mitigate between these two very different initiatives and to find the magic balance between commitments made separately to Ibn Saud and to the Israelis in 45 and then 48. Still, I think that another episode is at least as, and perhaps more deserving, for the role it played in setting the terms for America's long-term relationship in this part of the world. Now, this seismic event is rarely noted, usually forgotten. It never claimed a spot in our collective memory that its historical significance, I believe, merited. Its obscurity is rooted in part in the fact that it occurred in one of the most remote corners of the region, with a focus on a country about which Americans today know less, visit less, and have less engagement with than just about any other country in the Middle East. I'm referring to the country of Algeria. Add to that the fact that this episode left virtually no obvious imprint or lasting scars on the region's politics. And combine that with the fact that it is commonly viewed just as a transitory moment without direct impact on other key historical events or ongoing influence in U.S. policy. Now, I believe those judgments are wrong, and so my sort of radical rethinking of this is to invite all of you here today and to ask Eliot to lob as many arrows at this thesis as he likes, at the idea that Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, is, in fact, a far more important, the most under-recognized important event in the modern history of America's engagement with the Middle East. The 75th anniversary of this event is tomorrow, and so that is why we are all here today. If we can see if this works here. There it is. You can see the map up here. Torch was America's first offensive military operation of World War II, the most ambitious amphibious landing until that point in history, the first time U.S. troops landed on Arab soil since the Barbary Wars of the late 18th and early 19th century. It was a pivotal moment in the war, perhaps one of the most pivotal. It is largely forgotten today. Everyone remembers the later D-Day, the one at Normandy, but few remember the first D-Day, the one, as you see here, 3 landing zones, the furthest west being at Safi, south of Casablanca, Oran in the middle, and then east of Algiers in Sidi Farouche, the furthest east. Why is it that we forget today that hundreds of ships sailed thousands of miles through U-boat infested waters to launch this actually quite crazy scheme to attack in North Africa and go around Europe to open a second front? Why is it that few remember this? Oh, my theory is simple. It's because of who our enemy was. Our enemy being our once and future allies, the French. It was the greatest amphibious invasion in history, but it was against a neutral country. And America had never before attacked a neutral country, Vichy France. There are no great war films about Torch, and it's not really surprising. Not too many great scripts can be written about the romance of attacking a neutral country. Tomorrow, as I said, will be the first ever Torch commemoration on the Mall at the World War II Memorial. It will last, according to the director of the World War II Memorial, it will last all of 20 minutes. 20 minutes. So we're actually not here today to discuss Torch's role in World War II, although that's a great topic and perhaps we'll get into it. We're going to talk about Torch's role in what this institute focuses its mission on, namely the Middle East and the development of U.S. Middle East policy. Now, it's not because Torch succeeded against all odds as a military operation. The critical first step in the victory over Nazi Germany, that it deserves this recognition as a milestone in American Middle East policy. In fact, Torch had no lasting military impact on the region. There were no naval bases, airfields, or long-term deployments left from America's presence in North Africa. Indeed, it's virtually impossible to travel through North Africa and see any residue or artifact from the invasion. When I visited Algeria a few years ago, Algeria being the main target of Torch because Algiers was the capital of French North Africa, and I went to the Commonwealth Cemetery, I was surprised to see that there was no American cemetery. In fact, there is no place in all of Torch's target battlefields where any American rests, having given his life, American soldiers or sailors, that fateful day. Instead, all those bodies were either sent home or moved to a very moving site near the ruins of Carthage in Tunisia. Rather, Torch's lasting impact was political. It was while the proverbial dust was still being cleared from the heat of battle in the hours immediately after the troops came ashore in Algiers that two key decisions were made that I believe had profound impact both on the course of a critical aspect of the war and on America's long-term role in the Middle East. What were those decisions? The first decision was to discard the pre-invasion plan to replace North Africa's Vichy French governors with nationalist but anti-fascist officers. In its place, U.S. generals and diplomats opted for a hastily designed expedient, an alternative, an arrangement with Admiral Jean-François Darlan, the number 2 in the Vichy hierarchy, who happened to be in Algiers just by luck on the day of the invasion, a deal with him in exchange for unfettered access across North Africa to fight the Germans in Tunisia. The result was that, with the endorsement of American forces and diplomats, the fascists retained power in the region. Here you see this famous picture. The only one who's smiling really is the American diplomat. Ike is not too happy on the far left. Standing next to Ike is Jean-François Darlan, the admiral of the fleet, the number 2 of Vichy France. Standing next to him is Mark Clark, Eisenhower's number 2 for the invasion of North Africa, who then created the Fifth Army and led the invasion of Italy in 1943. By the way, just show and tell, this is an original from the invasion, from the Mark Clark's army in North Africa. This is my father's jacket. You can still see the Air Force, the 12th Air Force from service in North Africa. And my father, I remember growing up telling wonderful stories about his experience from Oran and Constantine and on through North Africa and into Italy. On the far right is Robert Murphy. Murphy is, if anybody, is the sort of villain of my story. He's responsible. He was ordered by Roosevelt to be his personal emissary in North Africa from 41 on. His principal mission was to make sure that the French didn't shoot back when the Americans were to invade, and he spent a year and a half trying to work with various opposition groups and unhappy generals and admirals to try to convince them that when the time comes for the eventual American invasion, they should welcome the invading forces. He failed miserably, and the French did shoot back, as I'll say a little bit more about this. And his other plans, namely to find an alternative French general to be the figurehead leader of North Africa, also failed miserably. But despite this, you can see how pleased he is to have arranged this alternative strategy at the very last minute, taking advantage of the fact that Pétain's number 2 was in Algiers on the day of the invasion, and instead of finding an alternative leadership, he did the deal directly with him, with Darlan. Now, the original plan, admittedly, was just the transfer of power from one set of colonial officers to another, but the plan had within it the seeds of a profound political and ideological shift that, over time, would have had a major impact on how France ruled the territories. This was, we should remember, the first opportunity that the Allies had to apply any of the principles of the war to liberated territories. North Africa was the first inch of Axis-controlled territory that the Allies arrived at. FDR had famously described to the people of the region a great jihad of freedom that the Americans were leading, but instead, when the Allies did arrive, they balked and ultimately punted. So instead, what Torch gave birth to was the first chapter of an instrumentalist strategy toward Arab lands, namely that what America's role in Arab lands is to use it to achieve other aims. In this case, to pass through Algeria and Morocco in order to get to Tunisia to fight the Germans, rather than having a goal and to engage with the lands themselves. A very different approach than, say, we had as we marched our way through Europe or through Asia as we liberated lands in those parts of the world. The second big decision of Torch, which I think had longer-term implications, revolved around the fact that immediately upon the landing in North Africa, Allied forces, especially the Americans, came face-to-face with what I call the Jewish question. Now, of course, this is a term from a different context, but it does apply here. By November 42, many of the details of what eventually would be called the Holocaust were well known. It was in November 42 that the State Department publicly confirmed reports of Nazi plans to annihilate the Jews of Europe. And just 6 weeks after Torch, 12 Allied governments issued a joint statement vowing retribution for those responsible for the extermination of Jews. The situation in North Africa was no less known, although it obviously of much different order of magnitude than in Europe. Steady stream of diplomatic reports and journalistic accounts outlawed the application of Vichy laws, stripping Jews of French citizenship, denying them of the rights to live, work, and study, and stories of the thousands of Jews who themselves were in French concentration or punishment camps in North Africa. Those were terms that the French used to describe these camps, not terms that were ascribed to them by outsiders. It's a little historical quirk. Not that the situation in Algeria and in Europe were by any means comparable, but one connection. There were only two places in the world where Jews actually lost their citizenship, became stateless during World War II. One of them, of course, Germany and Austria. The other is Algeria, where 150 some odd thousand Jews were stripped of their citizenship by Vichy law and were rendered stateless. And that was the situation in which the American forces found 150,000 Jews when the Allies arrived on November 8th. Now, it's important to remember, until Torch, the situation facing Jews for the Roosevelt administration was a very faraway problem. Horrible, deplorable, but a faraway problem. With Torch, however, for the first time, and remember this is nearly a year before the invasion of Italy, a year before they came into contact with Nazi-run camps in Europe, Torch put American troops in control of territories directly where Jews were facing government-ordained and implemented persecution, and where many of them, thousands of them, were in concentration camps. There's an additional wrinkle to the story, which only adds pathos, and that's a story that I came across when I first started doing research on this topic 15 years ago. It's the story of the nearly 400 Jews who were the partisans of the Algerian Jewish resistance movement, who helped make possible the entry of Allied forces. It's a fantastic story. I won't go into details now. Just to remind for history, this gentleman, his name is Jose Albuquerque, 20-year-old medical student who led 377 young men on the night of the Allied invasion to take over the city of Algiers, literally arresting the admirals and generals and prefects and cutting all the wires and taking over the city on the night of the Allied invasion, making it possible for the Allies in Algiers to walk in, not without firing a shot, but with much, much less response than in the other two landing zones. And in fact, the number of American dead in Algiers is much, much less than in the other two landing zones, precisely because of the exploits of these young men. And so my view is, for what it's worth, this Jewish resistance movement is the most consequential of the war. It's the one that nobody knows about, but it's the only one that actually changed the course of the war and the only one that saved American lives in the process of doing it, and deserves, therefore, I think, a special note of memory. Now, for American generals and diplomats on the day after Torch, pivoting from the original strategy for new leadership in North Africa to a partnership with the existing Vichy officers, the Jewish question was not a theoretical issue. It was an urgent and practical issue, and it revolved around three very specific questions. What to do with the hundreds of conspirators who risked their lives to help the Allies, what to do with about 8,000 Jews in concentration camps, and what to do with the 150,000 Jews who were rendered stateless by Vichy laws. Again, I'm not going to go into details except to say that the answer given by Murphy and given by the leaders on all these three issues, the narrow issue of the conspirators, all the way to the broader issue of what to do about Jewish rights, was do nothing to assist the Jews, even if it doesn't come at the expense of the Muslims. I'll say that again. It was to do nothing to assist the Jews, even if it doesn't come at the expense of Muslims. Where did they get this from? I can go into some great detail if you'd like, but my view is they essentially got this from the French. This was the Vichy strategy applied in North Africa that the American officials on the day after Torch, when they recognized they had this urgent set of issues, just adopted. And they took essentially from Darlan and his associates and the local prefects. In Algiers 42-43, therefore, was born a zero-sum approach to America's relations with Jews and Muslims, an idea that became a subtext, not the only text, but a subtext of U.S. policy toward the Middle East for decades to follow. It's important to underscore that this was not the product of the rise of Zionism or the fear of losing access to strategic oil resources. It was not a reaction to Arab rioting against Jewish empowerment or demands from Arab or Muslim religious figures that the masses would revolt if the United States did anything to assist the Jews. In fact, none of that happened. None of that happened in 42 and 43. On the contrary, there are numerous examples of Arab public figures siding with the Jews, opposing laws against Jews. Rather, the zero-sum approach was a gift, in my view, from the Americans, from the French to the Americans. Now, this isn't to say there wasn't anti-Semitism elsewhere in the U.S. government, or that even U.S. leaders all the way to Roosevelt didn't have certain anti-Semitic views. But North Africa was where those views came face to face with local politics and real decisions had to be made. And the result was betrayal of the Jews, with no discernible benefit to the Arabs. And that, I think, is very important. So we had, therefore, two strategic decisions, or two major decisions: to instrumentalize the Middle East for the sake of larger U.S. strategic interests, and to adopt a zero-sum approach toward U.S. relations between Muslims and Jews. These were not the only foundational principles of U.S. Middle East policy, but I think it's fair to say that they have certainly been present and at times dominant for the last 75 years. And both were products of Torch. Now, why does any of this matter? So first, as an historian, I always believe in the maxim that to know where you're going, you got to know where you're coming from. It was exactly 15 years ago Condi Rice offered her famous line, 60 years of pursuing stability at the expense of democracy has produced neither. Well, if you add 60 to the 15 years that have passed, you get 75. And that 75 is exactly today, which is Torch. Now, actually, my view is her analysis is quite debatable. I think we did get quite a lot in those 60 years. But it's important to know that where and when that policy began. It began really in Algeria in November 42. Second, I think it's useful to delve deeply into how it transpired. Yes, there was a grand strategy. Roosevelt was clear in his instructions to Murphy, envisioning no real change in the local French administration, that all he wanted was a compliant partner to enable Allied transit against North Africa. But as the plan as conceived became very different in practice, that plan fell apart in the heat of battle. An alternative was arranged on the spot. It was improvised. The improvisation was led by diplomats principally. And that improvisation, doing a deal with the local guy in charge, essentially became American policy and has been American policy in the Middle East ever since. What a wonderful example of the maxim that nothing is as permanent as the temporary. And then the zero-sum attitude. Third, the zero-sum attitude between Arabs and Jews. What do I really mean? I mean that American policy after the invasion was not even to restore Jews to the political and social status they had before the fascists arrived. I'm not talking about improving their status, just restoring their status. And the U.S. refused. All the way down the line. Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Clark, Murphy, all the way down the line. In my view, this totally misread the relationship between Muslims and Jews, exacerbating local relations beyond all recognition. This is not to say relations between Arabs and Jews or Muslims and Jews would not have been affected by Arab nationalism, Palestine, and other issues. But I believe that the U.S. decisions taken in Torch exacerbated those problems and expanded the circle of conflict. Faraway countries that otherwise would have had little contact with the events of Palestine felt it with full fury, not least because the U.S. assumed that Arabs and Jews necessarily had to have horrible relations. In other words, our actions played a role in the ultimate emptying out of Arab countries of their centuries-old Jewish populations. I'll give you a little vignette. Algiers was also the testing ground for decisions that came later in the war. Who arrives in Algiers in February 1943, right in the midst of the debate over whether the United States should restore Jewish rights? John McCloy, Assistant Secretary of War. 18 months later, he becomes famous or infamous for his letter explaining why the United States can't divert military resources to bomb Auschwitz. But 18 months earlier in Algiers, McCloy uses exactly the same language and exactly the same logic to explain why rights cannot be restored to the Jews, because of the fear that Arab unrest would require the diversion of U.S. military resources to address it. Almost the exact same language to explain later why not the bombing at Auschwitz. Fourth, the bureaucratic politics of the story is instructive. A key part of this was the State Department versus intelligence. State essentially arguing for the pro-Vichy anti-Jewish line, and intelligence, OSS, our agents and operatives on the ground, taking the opposite view. That's largely because they were the ones most closely dealing with the resistance movement, and they understood, they were dealing more closely with what the Jews. The Jews were at the heart of the resistance movement. Now, since OSS was only born in 1942, July, this Algiers was also the first ever clash between state and intel in our modern history. That's important to note, and I think I'd like to underscore this. The view of State Department officials was not uniform. Key diplomats in the field were just as outraged and disgusted by the betrayal of the Jews, and more broadly, the betrayal of American values, as were some OSS agents. It does cut across bureaucracies. But this idea of bureaucratic fighting was born in this challenge over what to do regarding the Jews. Just to close, it is tempting to ask, what if? In a military sense, the most significant what if, in my view, is what if Hitler either had blocked the Armada before it attacked North Africa, or if he hadn't made the foolish mistake of a last stand in Tunisia, but instead had decided to come down through Spain, take Gibraltar, and cut off the Allies from behind. Actually, I've never gotten a good answer as to why. Good, excellent. As to why he didn't do it. A defeat in North Africa, cutting us off behind, would have been disastrous, certainly for our war effort, even more so for Britain. But in a political sense, two what-ifs come to mind. Would democracy have found more receptivity in North Africa and perhaps elsewhere in Arabic-speaking countries if the United States had viewed them as at least relevant for the implementation of the principles of the Atlantic Charter? Second, would the circle of Arab-Jewish conflict have been more limited to Palestine and its immediate surroundings and not spread to a much larger circle that cost countries such as Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia their substantial Jewish populations if the United States had not fed a zero-sum attitude between these two communities? I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm not sure that what if questions are always useful. But I do believe in this case they are worth asking. All I know is American policy in the Holocaust, American policy toward Palestine, American policy toward democracy in the Middle East, American policy toward our strategic standing in this region. All roads lead back to Algiers, and all roads lead back to Torch, November 42. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back at the Washington Institute. It really is great to be back with my friend Rob Satloff. We have 30 years of respectful disagreement. He has taught me many things. Among other things, they never forget if they got something less than an unqualified A. So I'm here as a military historian, not as a Middle East expert. I'm going to be in the invidious position, perhaps, of trying to explain American behavior, but I wouldn't try to justify it. And, given, I'm a Jew and a pretty Jewy Jew at that, so it puts me in a bit of an invidious position. And on top of everything else, I'm going to have to deal with the bombing of Auschwitz, which I did not want to, but you went there. Let me say, Rob has done some really fantastic research on the story of the Algerian, the resistance in Algiers and that movement. I think that is a major contribution to historiography. It's a wonderful story, and I think the story of the occupation is also, it's not a wonderful story, it's a terrible story. It's a pretty deplorable story, and he's really laid that out, again, in a path-breaking way. And I will say that the problem of dealing with the Vichy mentality has been on my mind of late, but I'm not going to go there either. But I think there are a lot of problems with the argument. and they're basically fall into two buckets, one having to do with the historiography of the Second World War and having to do with the context. And there's my old comrade in arms, Jim Jeffrey.
Yeah, not from the Second World War.
If only, things would have been a hell of a lot better, you know, Jim? So let me, two historiographical sets. Yeah, but we would have won it better with Jim in charge. So the first is, this is a reductionist argument, namely that, and it's, I think we are all prone to this, that if this one event had just gone differently, everything else gets changed. And I think that's very rarely true. The stream of history is a set of decisions along the way, a set of events along the way, and it is very, very rare that you just say, okay, because of this decision at this moment, everything else was foreordained. I just don't believe history works that way. Secondly, I think it's really important to place torch in the history of World War II. It's not largely forgotten. I mean, military historians have written plenty about torch. It does not occupy a large place in the American imagination, but neither does Salerno. Neither does the Lorraine campaign, which were equally consequential. It was, by the way, an Anglo-American operation. There's always a bit of American solipsism in this. And the Brits, of course, in their very clever British way, had all the component commanders, and Eisenhower's chief of staff were Brits, which was quite clever of them. Why doesn't it get as much attention? I think Rob correctly says, well, it's a war against people who become our allies. That really is pretty important. It's not the only one. The British don't talk a whole lot about their invasion of Syria and Lebanon in 1941, which was the same kind of thing. They're taking on the Vichy regime. By the way, they get into similar kind of snarl with the Free French, and they do similar kinds of things for similar reasons. That would be interesting to look at the treatment of Syrian Jews in particular and see whether that changed. And I don't know enough that you might. As you go down this path, it might be interesting to make some comparisons there. The reason why it's never been a particularly popular campaign with the American military is first, it showed there were a lot of screw-ups. I mean, it is amazing that in 6 months we cooked this thing up, hurled this force across the Atlantic. Again, the British actually have a lot to do with this. We can go into the sort of the details of the history of deception operations, naval escort, and lots of other things, plus actual British troops. But the campaign itself, the North African campaign, particularly at the very beginning, Rick Atkinson does a very good job of covering this in his the first volume of his 3 volumes on the American War in Europe. There are a lot of screw-ups, everything from the way the landings are executed to combat loading of ships. We lose one ship with all of our radios on it. We don't make that mistake again. To the way in which air power is integrated with land forces, incompetent commanders, people you've never heard of who George Marshall has to relieve. It is not a great tale. It is not a great tale. And that's really the part after the French submit. Basically, the French fight for a couple of days. And they would have collapsed in Algiers, too. I mean, this was they were going to be overwhelmed anyhow. So I wouldn't even call it a kind of a war-changing event. But first, it's a campaign with a lot of screw-ups. And secondly, it's important to remember the American High Command did not want to do the North Africa landings. They argued very hard with Roosevelt to build up in Great Britain in 1942 and invade France in 1943. And for political reasons, Roosevelt says, no, we have to do this to sustain domestic support for focusing on Europe. Basically, the American military hated the idea of fighting in North Africa because they understood it would delay the main drive through France. In retrospect, by the way, thank goodness they lost because the United States military would not have been in shape to take on the Wehrmacht if it had landed in France in 1943. Okay, my main reservations about this are context. And basically what I want to do is I want to emphasize all the things that have nothing to do with the Middle East that are a very important part of understanding this episode and the American approach. And I speak as somebody who has not studied this in anything like Rob's depth. little technical point. This is not the first time that French territory had been liberated. There are actually lots of bits and pieces, including some islands off Canada. More importantly, major colonies in Africa. Those were done under British auspices. It's the first time the Americans are doing it. But this needs to be seen in the context of larger policy towards large swaths of occupied areas throughout Europe and Asia during World War II. And I would just point out that you get similar kinds of behavior, which in retrospect look pretty appalling, in Asia. We take the Japanese army and we turn them into our occupation troops. And that happens in a number of the areas in some parts of Vietnam. It happens in Indonesia. It happens in Korea. When you're coming into these chaotic situations, the natural thing for an invading army is to say, let's let the locals sort it out. And indeed, even in Germany, all of our ambitious denazification programs go out the window in order to make cities and villages run, because if the guy who runs the power plant is a member of the Nazi Party, you're still going to swallow hard and keep them there. So there's the context for a lot of the decision making really should be seen much more broadly. Second piece of context, de Gaulle. You have to remember Roosevelt hated de Gaulle. The British had an ambivalent attitude towards de Gaulle. Churchill once said, of all the crosses I had to bear during the war, the cross of Lorraine, that's a symbol of the Free French, was the heaviest one of all. But Churchill was much more sympathetic to de Gaulle. Roosevelt, from the very beginning, mistrusted de Gaulle because he saw him as a man on horseback. He saw him as a future military dictator. He saw him as a sort of a Napoleon, or if not of that stature, sort of a Boulanger, for those of you who know your French history, the kind of guy who would set himself up as a dictator. So part of what they're looking for is neutral military leaders who are simply professional. And by the way, that is where we go. Now we go with Giraud, who who ends up being the Governor General for a while, although he's miserably unpopular, who'd been one of the prominent French generals in 1940, captured, escaped, and who is studiously neutral and politically completely inept and has no backing. A more important French general, somebody you've never heard of, Alphonse Juin. So really important to remember that actually the French army does come over to the Allied side, that is the North African army. It is re-equipped with American equipment, and they all go off and fight in Italy, which is why you've never heard of them. There's only one division of Free French that comes through Normandy, and they go tearing off and liberate Paris against Eisenhower's wishes. But the bulk of the French army that fights on the American side in World War II is the Vichy Army of North Africa, led by Alphonse Juin, who, by the way, was very competent. So again, part of the overall picture here is these are the guys we want as allies, and Free French and all that, we don't really want that so much. Connected with this, let me recommend to everybody here a very old book by William Langer, who was the head of research and analysis in the OSS, but also the most distinguished diplomatic historian of his time, and Everett Gleason, called Our Vichy Gamble. You have to remember, unlike the British, we maintained diplomatic relations with Vichy all the way through. This was done, by the way, with British understanding, because part of the idea is that you wanted to keep a connection there and you wanted to be able to muscle the French. And there are times when we work together with the British to keep the French in line. This gets to explaining why they don't go through Spain. We also muscle both the French and the Spanish the same way. They're dependent in part on what was known as certs, certifications which allowed ships carrying grain to come through the blockade. So we're actually helping feed France and Spain. We make it very clear to the French and to the Spanish, you turn on the British, you're going to starve. Also, the Germans did look, by the way, at going through Spain, and they concluded the terrain is miserable. I mean, it's not just a drive on the Autobahn. The logistical difficulties would be enormous, and the Spanish are crazy enough to fight. They had made one effort to bring Franco into the war in 1940. He wanted no part of it. He wanted even less of it in 1942 when the Americans are in. So it was going to be a non-starter. We worried about it, but it was a complete non-starter from the German point of view to drive through Spain. So because you have to remember there's this Vichy connection. And so the Americans are, and remember too, that our ambassador to Vichy was William Leahy. Who's William Leahy? United States admiral who ends up as the de facto chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II. So kind of that's built into our policies that we're going to have a relationship with Vichy. We don't have the same animus against them that the British do for a whole bunch of reasons, because the British view is these guys left us and cut a deal with the Germans. Fourth piece of context. You mentioned, but I don't think you gave enough weight to the amount of ambient anti-Semitism in the American government back then, and particularly in the military. There's a very good book by a man named Joseph Bendersky about anti-Semitism in the United States Army, and it is breathtaking. I'm not just talking about the standard kind of stuff that, you know, I'm sure many people in this room had parents who served in the forces who experienced it. I'm talking really high-level stuff, where Jews were sort of associated with communists. And, you know, back then, the world was a different place. And there was quite a bit of anti-Semitism. So it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. And there are a lot of other people they didn't like. They didn't like black people. You know, Marshall and Eisenhower were not particularly friendly to African Americans. Let's not forget that. It was a different time and a different place. And so that, I think, helps shape a lot of it. And finally, in terms of context, the overwhelming focus that everybody had was on winning the war. That's what they're thinking about. How do we win the war? And all this other stuff is kind of a distraction or a drain on resources. It was, you know, it's typical American fixation on we're going to do whatever it takes to win. By the way, that I would never want to defend John McCloy, who was not an attractive human being, not a friend of the Jews. I get all that. But I also understand that that was, I think, a large part of the Auschwitz decision. The other part is just from a technical point of view, the idea that by bombing Auschwitz you do much besides kill lots of people who are going to be killed later, I don't know. You know, you're not going to cut rail lines. Rail lines that get cut can be fixed in 2 hours. I've viewed that whole sad tale as frankly, as a distraction from larger questions having to do with American policy towards the Holocaust. It's a real red herring. But in any case, I think this overwhelming focus on winning the war also helps explain why you're going to listen to the people on the ground. Remember also, the people on the ground really was the State Department. The lot of the sources for intelligence gathering were not the OSS. Yes, they infiltrated some of those people in to do resistance work. It was the American consulates, which we had very deliberately kept active. That was, again, part of the reason for the maintaining relations with Vichy. Those are the people gathering information. The people on the ground, not surprisingly, kind of buy off into the French colonial administration's view of things. Last thing I'll say. I don't think you need this episode to understand American Middle East policy. I really don't. It's not hard to figure out. There's oil, and we need oil, and we want oil. There are lots and lots of Arabs and not many Jews. Who knows if this whole Jewish settlement in Palestine thing is going to work out? And besides, there are a bunch of socialists. So, and we know in 46, 47, that the Arabs really don't like this. And there are enough manifestations, whether you're looking at riots in Iraq or anywhere else, to know that the Arab world is pretty vehemently opposed to the establishment of a Jewish state. So it doesn't surprise me that we ended up viewing it as a zero-sum game. Now, maybe enlightened statecraft would have said, you know, there's another way forward. I grant you that. But I don't think it's mysterious, and I don't think you have to go back to this particular story and this particular episode to say that that's that's what you see going. That's what you see going forward. And I think you'd even find you'd have trouble in the historical record as you look at American decision making particularly about the question of Palestine and ultimately of Israel. I don't think you're going to see many references back to, well, this is how we handled the occupation of North Africa. So my bottom line is it's an important story. It's a depressing story. It's a very interesting story, but I think it's possible to read too much into it. And we'll see if you ever invite me back to lunch again.
Great. Well, it's on now. Great. Well, thank you, Eliot. I appreciate that. See, yes, of course. You kidding me? So just a couple of remarks. First, in no particular order, you're right about the British. Actually, what people tend to forget, for example, about another very unhappy episode of the war, namely the Farhud in Baghdad in June 1st and 2nd, 1941. This is the episode when, after the pro-fascist government flees, there's a pogrom against the Jews of Baghdad, and hundreds of Jews are killed, and thousands are injured, and property is destroyed. What people tend to forget is that the people in charge of Baghdad, or surrounding Baghdad at the time, were the British Army. And for 3 days, this occurred while the British, fully conscious of what was going on inside of Baghdad, didn't do anything. I always disappoint friends of mine who don't put this episode in the context of sort of the Holocaust, but I put it rather in the context of sort of disreputable actions by allies. Namely, the Allies did nothing to intervene at a key moment. In this case, the Brits. So the Brits don't have clean hands either on this.
Even that episode, again, I'm not going to defend the Brits.
He's going to defend the Brits here.
No, it's more complicated than you're letting on. There was a substantial Iraqi army. The Germans were actually flying into Mosul. I remember when I went to Mosul for the first time, I was really curious to see the airport because there were actually German airplanes operating out of Mosul. Habaniya, which was the main air base, was besieged by the Iraqi army. There's this relief force that comes out of Jordan as a combination of Arab Legion and other things. And by the way, the first head of the Irgun, David Raziel, ends up dying on a mission for the British Army against Iraq. But they had a very... You have to remember the Brits are actually spread very thin in the Middle East. They did not have Baghdad in an iron grip. That doesn't excuse this. But I'm just saying, again, important to bear in mind what the context is that these people are operating in. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, no, that's de Gaulle. I think Eliot is absolutely right. Roosevelt disliked de Gaulle immensely. I think my own reading is less for fear that de Gaulle was going to be a man on a horseback than just because he was a self-aggrandizing, sort of incompetent, but both self-aggrandizing and incompetent. The opposition headquarters leaked like a sieve. I mean, he had done Dakar, which was a huge failure. The French officer corps hated de Gaulle, and there was really no percentage from the American perspective in working with de Gaulle. As it turned out, of course, we were forced to swallow our views of de Gaulle very soon. By January, Torch was the first week of November. By January, we had to get de Gaulle. De Gaulle came to Casablanca for this, the blessing of Churchill, Roosevelt, de Gaulle, and Giraud all in one photo. And then by November, Giraud was out, and de Gaulle was the omnipotent leader of the French forces. And, you know, to his great credit, the day after de Gaulle became the head of the French National Committee in Algiers, Jewish rights were restored by decree by de Gaulle, who clearly did not view it so problematic for his own control of the area that he held back from taking the actions that the Allies didn't do for an entire year. Third, I did not mean to actually suggest or have the debate about the wisdom of bombing Auschwitz. My point is just merely to point out that Algiers was sort of the off-Broadway run where a lot of these actors had their first chance at making these decisions, and we see them. We see what become more famous actions later in the war, first done here, because this is the first place that they come face to face with these questions. So the same rationale, the same logic, the same decisions are first done here, and then we see them in a bigger way later in the war. I take the point about how we shouldn't read too much into it, but we have to look for origins somewhere, and this is America's first political military engagement with Arabs and Jews on the ground, and important decisions were made, and I think we don't give them enough credit to take them seriously for making those decisions. Now we can, I think we do run the risk if we try to, stretch this too far. But these were in many cases the same people over time. I mean, Murphy, the Murphy of Algiers 42 is the same Murphy who is responsible for American policy in Lebanon in '58, and who brings responsible for the played a role in how Eisenhower dealt with Suez, and his relationships with Arabs and Jews for the next 15 years. A lot of that was formed, I would argue, in the crucible of this experience. Yes, we don't want to expand on it too far, but we also don't want to give it short shrift. And I think we learn something if we give it the credit that it's due. I'll leave it at that. Open the floor for your questions and comments. Yes. If you could take the mic and
Tom Parker, George Washington University. Eliot, would you like to comment briefly on your assessment of Charles de Gaulle's role in World War II?
Well, he saved the honor of France, and that's no small thing. I think it's hard for us even today to really fully come to grips with the trauma that 1940 imposed on the French. And de Gaulle, by quite courageously breaking with the Vichy government, breaking the bonds of discipline, siding with the British, even after the attack on the French fleet at Oran, which happens really a month after the armistice, where the Brits kill 2,000 French sailors because they're not going to let the fleet fall into German hands. A man of enormous courage. And an inspiring figure for Frenchmen around the world. Now, admittedly, initially it's really only a small group that rallies around him, but that group gets larger. He's also clearly the most politically skilled of the French generals. I mean, Giraud was a nincompoop. Juin, who's really the most, in terms of the French commander who actually commands the most French troops. And again, you talk about a forgotten army. It's the North African army, which fights in Italy, and by the way, also is part of the Dragoon landings in the south of France. A large part of the south of France is liberated by French troops under Juin. But Juin was also a kind of simply a professional, whereas de Gaulle was, politically remarkably astute. And it shows, by the way, also in the way in which he forces Eisenhower's hand in terms of the liberation of Paris, that it'll be Leclerc's, Second Armored Division. Thanks, Jim. I can always turn to Jim on military detail. I've learned that early on in our relationship at State. He turns the Second Armored Division onto Paris. Eisenhower does not want, thinks the liberation of Paris is premature, it's not necessary, and de Gaulle decides to force his hand, and he says, Paris is going to be liberated by Frenchmen. That's also tremendously important. So I'd say it's with all that de Gaulle was a complete pain in the neck to deal with. The world owes him. It's not just Frenchmen owe him a lot. The world owes him a lot because France could have been a profoundly messed up country after World War II. More than it was, which is saying something.
Thanks, Paul Sham, University of Maryland. First, thanks for a riveting discussion. I wish you'd do more historical discussions like this as pure history. But I see this not as Arabs and Jews. I see it as a clear Allied or American and British preference for Europeans. The Americans might have been traditionally anti-colonialist, but they weren't there to disturb the pre-war status quo. In most places, the Americans supported the colonial government. So it seems to me that the Americans and the British, who had their own empire to worry about, of course, wanted to keep the status quo, didn't want to empower natives, whether Jews or Arabs, and that was the simplest and most effective in the long run strategy, and not offending the French, of course.
If U.S. strategy was merely to maintain the pre-war status quo, I would say you're right. But that wasn't what the decision was. From the day Torch happened until the day de Gaulle showed up took over in Algiers in November of 43, for a year, U.S. policy was to maintain the Vichy status quo, not the pre-war status quo. The debate was, do we restore Jewish rights to what they were before Vichy came, or do we sustain, essentially, Vichy's discriminatory policy against Jews? And the decision was, sustain the Vichy discriminatory policy against Jews. It was only when de Gaulle came that restoring the pre-war status of Jews became the policy. So in that sense, and you can see it from the files, the diplomatic record is quite clear here, which is any change, even to restore the status quo ante, any change would enrage the Arab population. The fact that, regrettably, however, there was zero evidence for this. You don't see any Arabs coming to the consulate saying, don't do X, Y, or Z. On the contrary, you see Arabs issue declarations saying, you know, what they're doing to the Jews doesn't help us. It's please don't think that depriving Jews of their rights makes us happy, because we're still pretty bad off.
So let me just add two thoughts. The first is, I mean, Roosevelt was quite sincerely, he was of the view that the European colonial empires were doomed by World War II. But he and very much his military commanders in the field said, right, we'll deal with that one after the war. It was, I think it is hard for us today to kind of understand that mindset of, look, we're going to win the war. That is job 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And all this other stuff may be important after the war, but we're going to deal with that after the war. And if it helps win the war, then we'll do it. And if it doesn't help win the war, we won't do it. It was a kind of a strategic mentality which we don't have anymore. Second thing, which is, and this is really in a way a question for Rob, I am not an expert at all on Jewish-Arab relations in North Africa. But I do recall there was this thing called the Loi Crémieux, which gave Jews citizenship, and of course Arabs did not have citizenship in North Africa. And my understanding is that actually was a considerable source of friction between the Jewish and the Arab communities. I'm perfectly willing to believe that the friction was nothing like what we believe now, but the Loi Crémieux goes back to sometime in the 19th century, late, I think, 1880s or something like that. And so that the friction was real, I can believe. That it may have not been the top thing on Arab agendas, I can also believe.
Yeah, so what Eliot is referring to is a decree from the French Interior Minister, who was himself Jewish, Adolphe Crémieux, in 1870, which gave, in Algeria, this didn't apply to Morocco or Tunisia, the French protectorates, but in Algeria, which gave Jews the option of seeking French citizenship if they were to give up their status as indigenous and being judged by local indigenous religious courts. And tens of thousands of French Jews took this. This did create animosity between certainly the late 18th century. But what the real animosity that it created wasn't so much between the Arabs and the Jews, but between the French colons and the Jews, who hated the idea that these indigenous Jews, who they viewed as the same as any other indigenous people, that they should have the right of French citizenship. And it even more than feeding animosity between Jews and Muslims, or Jews and Arabs in Algeria, it fed real anti-Semitism by the French colons and the Jews, which is one of the reasons why. I mean, it's another longer story. The French colons were the why was Vichy? Vichy was not unpopular in Algeria. There were multiple reasons. One was this, and the other is because they never had a German occupation. Right. So they only saw one side of what it meant to be Vichy, which is you get to take away Jewish rights, you get to confiscate Jewish property, you get to have a more nationalist, church-oriented, old traditionalist government with none of the downside of the German occupation. And so it was fairly popular in Algeria, among the French colons, to have Vichy rule.
Many of whom were Italian.
Yes, the French colons were, we say French, but there were many Italians, Maltese, Spanish. It was a bit of a complicated ethno mix. Yes, Howard, and then we'll work our way around.
Howard Sumka, former USAID. I wonder if, Eliot, you could expand on the comment you made about the extent of anti-Semitism in the U.S. military at the time. In particular, were you referring to the internal dynamics of the military, how it affected personnel and so on, or did it seep into senior military staff's recommendations for strategy and tactics during the war itself?
Well, again, you might want to look at the Bendersky book. There are a lot of senior figures. So, for example, MacArthur's intelligence officer, Charles Willoughby, a notorious anti-Semite. Now, some of this was connected with, one thing to remember is it's not just the FBI that's looking out for internal subversion, it's also the uniformed military intelligence services, both ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Military Intelligence Department of the General Staff. They, and they're out there looking for saboteurs and so on. And a lot of this is kind of following on from the Red Scares of the 20s and their concern about immigration. All sounds familiar, doesn't it? And kind of the mongrelization of Americans. And again, remember, this is a largely Southern officer corps, so they're bringing kind of a package of racial attitudes. And then there are the communists out there, and we all know Jews are communists. So what you're running into is beyond the kind of casual anti-Semitism that, not my dad, he was a doctor, but my wife's uncle remembers encountering when he goes in as an infantryman, which is, I think, sort of typical ethnic. The Irish hate the Poles, hate the Jews, hate the Italians, because, it's kind of raw ethnic politics of that type. At the higher levels in the United States Army, there was a real wariness about Jews, and again, we have to remind ourselves, conventional forms of bigotry were quite customary. Remember George C. Marshall, who was a great man. I stipulate that. Was dead set against the integration of the United States Army. Dead set against it. Even Eisenhower was not that keen on it.
Just in this context, I tell the story of Mark Clark. Mark Clark, the commander in North Africa, was himself born Jewish. And when he was a young man, still a cadet, at West Point, he got himself baptized Episcopalian. And this proved to be a good career move. He became the youngest three-star general in the war. Did this have any impact? I haven't the foggiest idea in terms of his decision-making. And I don't go there because I don't know. But it's clear that being Jewish had a role to play in his own development and his own psyche.
I will just say that I think it's fair to say that the judgment of military historians is that he was a not particularly talented schmuck.
Abe, and then we come over here. That's a technical.
That's the sort of technical analysis.
Thank you. This has been really fascinating. It seems to me that the key question that would have faced the military guys when they arrived is who can keep order in North Africa so that we don't have to, right? I mean, that would have been their main concern, I suppose. And if you wanted to then continue eastward and fight the Germans who were attacking Egypt and so forth, your main thought was we want there to be order in this area that we don't have to enforce. And I'm just wondering, do you have any sense of what the estimates were of what kind of problems there would be? I mean, the fact that Darlan is willing to cooperate suggests that morale in the Vichy apparatus couldn't have been quite that high, and that they would have been flexible and so forth. I'm just wondering if there was any real intelligence about what would cause disorder, maybe not so much from the Arabs, which you've emphasized, but from the French apparatus that you were going to depend on to maintain the order and services and so forth, so that you could ignore it.
Eliot referred to all the consuls that we had across North Africa, and their main task was to engage with French officers. Their main task was to see what, French military operations, but to engage with French officers. By and large, they got their analysis wasn't very good. Abortive plots. We put a lot of emphasis on trying to do things in Casablanca and Oran, and the guys didn't show up or they were called off at the last minute, and huge amount of effort was put into this, and it went nowhere. In the end, we empowered the local Vichy prefects, and they did their job, and there wasn't any backlash. Now, we did have quite a few of these consuls complain, saying all the guys that I've been working with that helped us in the preparation of the landings, either they're in jail, forget the Jews, I'm just French officers who were viewed as turncoats by the Vichy officers who retained their position after the invasion. A lot of them ended up in jail or ended up cashiered. And there was nothing that we could do about it, nothing that we decided to do about it.
So, two things. One thing to remember is they know that the following campaign is into Tunisia, and that if we went back to the map, you'd see, boy, those are some really long supply lines through really difficult territory. So the first thought that Eisenhower and all the rest of the thing is, oh my God, the last thing I need is anybody blowing up bridges or planting mines or taking pot shots at drivers and whatnot. Second thing is, I think they understood quite well that the Vichy military was not pro-German. It was not pro-German. And in fact, again, this is why the overall context matters. The French army of 100,000, the Vichy, remember, the Germans occupy, I think, like 3/5 of France. About 2/5 of France, the south, is under Vichy control, and they are allowed an army of 100,000. And they are careful to keep out people who they think are simply pro-German. And Darlan had been in touch with both the British and the Americans before. He didn't like the British, but he didn't like the Germans either. In fact, the French Navy in Toulon, where there was still a good chunk of the French Navy was around, they scuttled themselves as soon as the Germans come rolling in 1942, which they do after the landings. So I think the Americans thought that the Vichy French were not going to fight on the German side unless you really prompted them to. And I think they also understood that the fighting when we do land in Morocco is, in that wonderfully French way, maintaining honor. And particularly for a country that had gotten clobbered so badly in 1940, that was perhaps non-trivial for them. But I don't think that they thought that these guys were actually siding with the Germans. They believed that they would come over. And I think that also probably helps explain what is kind of a reprehensible attitude to Vichy.
Yes.
I'm going to have to split a little bit.
Okay. Yep. We'll take some questions, Pat and Eric, and then we'll split.
Hi, Roger Pajak, formerly of the Treasury Department, and a former colleague of Eliot's at the Naval War College.
Right.
Just would like to bring up the topic of General Mark Clark and his antics in the Torch operation. To what extent did General Clark have any impact on the political situation in North Africa at the time and on later Middle East policy, if any?
Okay. Eric, want to ask you a question?
Sure.
And then Peter, and then we'll bring it to a close.
My recollection that those hundreds of Jewish partisans were ultimately saved from execution by the intelligence services. The state was not going to interfere. What does that say about the relative strength or ascendancy of intelligence versus state going forward?
Okay. And Peter?
Thanks. Relying on my own memory, I remember the tremendous impact that Torch had on domestic views of the war. The government produced a documentary, which is, as I recall, it was in color, which was very unusual at the time, which made the whole campaign look like a walk in the park and did not mention the British, and had a tremendous impact on domestic opinion. Everyone saw it.
Right. Just a couple of brief comments. First, Clark played a key role in the negotiation of the deal with Darlan But then he leaves the scene pretty soon thereafter to set up the headquarters of the Fifth Army in Oujda and the preparations for the eventual move to Italy, which is good because he's not a very good. He didn't really have a good political feel for the scene anyway. State OSS. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate in terms of the State Department. This was it wasn't. It was just a couple of the leaders of the resistance were arrested and then were about to be executed. Murphy knew about this and did nothing. But a couple of OSS operatives got to this site and basically paid off the guys and saved the leaders of the resistance. I don't want to exaggerate that this is state versus OSS, but it does say something about what the priorities of the two groups were at the time. And just lastly, Peter, the political context I think is really fascinating. A torch occurred 4 days after the midterm elections of 1942. Roosevelt would have liked torch to come before, but it didn't quite work out that way. The Democrats were soundly defeated in the midterm elections. So this great victory came a couple of days too late to help Roosevelt. But then what happened with the Darlan deal becomes there's this big celebration about invasion of North Africa, but then the Darlan deal becomes a huge political stain on Roosevelt, and he has to explain it away. This is temporary. This is an expedient. We're not going to stick with this. We're going to bring democracy. We're going to bring change. Everyone's going to get their rights. I'm going to free everybody from Nazi jails. He makes a big speech 2 weeks after Torch. He makes all these promises, none of which get implemented. He had to run away from the political damage of doing the Darlan deal. But before long, people move on. I mean, because we're obviously in a war. But it's a very interesting moment where, election defeat, military victory, and then a stain on military victory that he has to try to recuperate.
So, but Mark Clark, Rob answered that. OSS, Department of State, one way to think about it is it's partly, the OSS represents the new American foreign policy elite in some measure. These are the people who are in just for the war. This is the old State Department back then was, you had to have your family money. It really was socially very, very insular. The OSS had some of that too, but it was a much more rambunctious, more, in my mind, more American kind of outfit. So I think there is something symbolic there. So Torch, the political significance, and that, let me just say a few words about that. Because again, it gives you context. So the idea for landings in North Africa are a British idea, which is advanced in June of 1942. And basically, Roosevelt orders the Torch landings over the objections of both Marshall and Admiral King, the head of the Navy, for the following reason. He said, we've all agreed that American strategy should be to focus on Germany first. They're the most important enemy, not Japan. But the war began for us with the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. And if I'm going to sustain political support for a strategy of Germany first, substantial American ground forces have to be engaged in the European theater of operations within a year of the beginning of the war, and that's why we're going to do it. And he signs an instruction, as he always did during the war, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief, just so everybody understood who's in charge. Marshall never accepted that. Marshall, to his dying day, thought this was a mistake. He tells an interviewer after the war, he said, I guess I didn't understand the need to keep the American public entertained in peacetime, in wartime. I wish I could find a better way of putting it, but I just can't. So from Roosevelt, and Roosevelt, I think, was wise in this way. He understood, he was right. You had to have political support for what was going to be pouring a lot of effort into this operation. And it was a big deal for Americans that even though, Guadalcanal gets launched, this is the United States on the move. There's a one last story that was fascinating. To get the American people ready for it, there's a speech by General Leslie McNair, who's the commander of Army Ground Forces, in charge of training all of the U.S. Army, after whom Fort McNair is named. He was later killed by the United States Air Force during Normandy operations. He got a little bit too close to the bomb line. It's one of the first national speeches broadcast simultaneously. And it's called the Killing Speech because he's addressing the American people, believing that they are not ready for what they're about to engage in. And he just uses the word kill over and over again. So we're in the business of killing. It's kill or be killed. Our enemies are past masters at killing. The sooner we get in the killing mood, the better. And you know, in retrospect, what McNair was doing was trying to spin up the American people and prepare them also for the casualties that would ensue. So this was understood as a major political event, not only by the political leadership, but even by the military leadership as well.
Friends, thank you very much for joining us for this event. Thank you, Eliot.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. No, that was great. Excellent. Thank you.